master morality, which was the morality of the Greeks in the Renaissance, and a slave morality, which he says was the morality of the Christians. He says, well, the master morality of the Greeks goes back to the Iliad. And when you look at the conception of virtue, originally virtu, it meant doing something well, doing something with power. And out of that came the whole idea of the Olympiad, of excelling in something, and the whole morality of the nobility that went along with that, the morality of power. And the enemy is regarded as good. The enemy is not bad. Greeks and Trojans have equal respect for each other because there's an equal recognition of power. What is bad is he who is not part of the nobility. The slaves are bad. They're beneath the contrast that with the morality that came into being amongst the Christians. And Christianity did begin partially amongst slaves with the idea of an absolute distinction between good and evil. He is good who has no power to harm us. He is good who obeys rules. And so we get a new conception of virtue now, not as doing something well, but as following rules. And you have a kind of morality now of dependence, of keeping in your place, of not rocking the boat. The idea that if you perform your duties and perform them well, God will reward you. This is the morality of slaves. And it makes a distinction, whereas the master morality made a distinction between good and bad. Evil doesn't exist in that system. The slave morality makes a distinction between good and evil. Who is evil in this system? He is evil who has power, power to harm us. The nobility is evil. The emperor is evil. Those are evil who can do us harm. And so we have two totally contrasting moral systems there. And Nietzsche was really the first to sort of archaeologically unearth these different systems, even within the Western tradition. I mean, even looking at the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And then in the New Testament, your neighbor slaps you, you turn the other cheek. There's even there a contrast, two totally different ethics that don't match up at all. Which is it? And so that's the sociological function of myth, is to validate specific ethical systems. And normally those ethics are cosmologically validated. They are built into the structure of the universe. The idea of the woman throwing herself on the flames in India was a validation of dharma, the ethic that is the way of the cosmos. Just as the moon will always do its thing, so too in society we will always do our thing. There is no questioning. You are not allowed to criticize and question. This tradition of fostering individual criticism does not exist and has not existed in India. The way of things is written in the cosmos. And the cosmological image itself should be built in such a way as to touch the energies of eternity. So the final function of mythology, of a traditional mythology, is what might be termed then the psychological function. And the psychological function involves, in many ways, it's the most important, because it involves carrying the individual through the various phases of the life cycle. You start out, and at least for 12 years, the individual is in an attitude of dependency on its parents. In tribal societies, they mark it at 12. We tend to say 18, 21. And the idea in the individual is to foster an attitude of respect for elders and of dependency. But once adolescence comes, initiation rituals traditionally have been evolved to bring the individual out of an attitude of irresponsibility and dependency to an attitude of self-responsibility, self-reliant authority. You are not, as an adult, to always think, well, what would dad say? What would mom say? You now, yourself, are father or mother and must now assume the responsibility for maturity. But very often in a society in which, such as our own, in which initiation rituals have all but disintegrated, you get individuals who don't make this transition, who are full-grown adults still thinking like children. And that might be defined as a neurotic, someone who is still psychologically in a condition of dependency. The myths weren't there to guide them over the threshold at the moment they needed it. And it might be said that the phenomenon of gangs is related to this attempt to create initiation rituals to help bring the individuals into a sense of maturity, that you can accomplish something. Nobody else is taking them into account, why not? And then you have the other life crisis, which occurs supposedly right around the age of 40, when you now have assumed responsibility for your life, and no sooner are you doing something well than the society has no need for you. So now you have to move from the position of responsibility to a position of nobody needs me. And the guide into old age and the making ready for death is the primary concern of mythology at this point. The idea is, as Jung puts it, really the second half of life is the preparation for death. And myths will have a whole new context that will refer forward to that, rather than Freudian psychology is really referring backward to childhood. It's still working on the material that you left behind there in childhood that should now be brought to being to help bring you into full maturity. But with Jung psychology is really for, and does tend to appeal to older folks, because there is a recognition there that there are these inexhaustible energies to the cosmos, and what really have I contributed to all of this? Campbell used to tell a story about how the old Barnum and Bailey circuses would put on these old freak shows, and people would wander into the tent and they would see, the mutant dwarf or the elephant man or what have you, and the tent would be filling up with so many people that they couldn't figure out how to get them out. And so somebody had the bright idea that instead of putting up an exit sign, we put up the words, to the grand egress. And the individuals would think that they were going for an experience that they thought they would have, and when they arrived there, it's not what they thought they were going to get at all. Egress, of course, means to move out. And so that, in a certain sense, is kind of the idea of what these religions do. What difference does it make what's on the other side, as long as these symbols give you a map that helps keep you from going crazy trying to figure it out? The idea is to move them out. And so myths help with these transformations, these threshold crossings in the life cycle. And those are the four primary functions of a valid traditional mythology. Now, with respect to religion itself, I tend to think of mythology as really have myths wherever you have the telling of stories. And religion itself is really systematized myth. It is petrified myth. It is mythology that has been taken up by a priesthood and codified and dogmatized in such a way as to prevent change. Well, myths are all about change. Myths come from the same zone as dreams. You go to sleep at night, you have dreams, and you're getting different images every night. And when the great visionaries go out into the deserts, be it a Buddha going out into the forest, or Muhammad going up into his cave, or Christ going out into the desert, each one of them receives a different mythological vision. And the vision is alive, and it's always changing and moving because the imagination is alive. It's always changing and moving. And the individuals come back to their society and say, here, I've had this vision. And a group of disciples begins to agglomerate around them who think that the vision is so great that it needs to be frozen in stone. And so you begin to get the formation of a priesthood who freezes the image as though it were frozen in time. And there's an intense conservatism. You have rituals, and rituals are enactments of myth. You can have a ritual within which the myth is forgotten. Like, for example, that great Shirley Jackson story where some of you probably read it, where they end up stoning the girl to death and nobody knows why they do it. They've forgotten what the myth is, but they're still performing this ancient fertility ritual of sacrificing to the earth. So you have to have myth first, then you have its codification into dogma and its working out in terms of a valid ritual that will evoke these energies. And religion is really something that is built to organize the energies of mythology and harmonize them. I have a friend who's a priest who said, well, what's the difference? I asked him, what do you think the difference is between religion and spirituality generally? They said, well, it's a little bit like this. Religion is when you get in the mail a brochure that describes the Bahamas. It's all described for you, laid out, very attractive, inviting package. Spirituality is actually going to the Bahamas. And so with respect to spirituality now, Jung used to say, religion can be a defense against the having of a religious experience. And so that's the shadow side of religion, that these images are frozen and built almost as a system of defenses to prevent the occurrence of a true mystical experience, which is an individualistic phenomenon and happens to you at any time and any place. Now, moving into spirituality, what is spirituality? Spirituality comes from the Latin term spiritus, which means originally wind. What is wind? Well, it's not something that you can see, but you know it's there because it's blowing the leaves around. It's making tornadoes and so forth. So the presence of an invisible entity is inferred from its visible effects.